The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and broken promises. James stood outside his father's room, watching through the small window as Elena dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that never quite touched her face. She'd been at it for 10 minutes now, the same theatrical grief she'd performed for every nurse, doctor, and visitor who'd walked past. His father lay motionless in the bed, tubes snaking from his arms, monitors beeping their steady rhythm. The stroke had come suddenly, viciously, leaving the old man trapped in his own body. The doctors said he could hear everything, understand everything, but his ability to speak or move was severely limited. Perhaps temporarily. Perhaps not. Elena looked up as James entered, and her expression shifted seamlessly from grief to brave solidarity. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed, reaching for his hand. "I'm so glad you're here. This is all so overwhelming." James kept his distance, taking the chair on the opposite side of his father's bed. He watched his father's eyes, the only part of him that seemed fully alive, track the movement. There was something there, something urgent in that gaze. "The doctors said the next 48 hours are critical," Elena continued, moving around the bed to stand closer to James. Her perfume was too heavy, too present. "We need to make some decisions. About his care. About everything." "We?" James raised an eyebrow. "You've been dating my father for what, 8 months?" 10, she corrected, her voice taking on a wounded edge. 10 months. "And in that time, I've been by his side constantly. I know what he wants. What he needs." James looked at his father again. The old man's eyes had closed, but there was tension in his jaw, a tightness that spoke volumes. "I'm sure you have opinions," James said carefully. "But I'm his son. I'm his medical proxy. Any decisions go through me." Elena's expression flickered, just for a moment, and James saw something cold flash across her features before the mask of concern returned. "Of course. I would never presume. I just want to help. I know this must be so difficult for you." She moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights beginning to glow in the evening darkness. "You know, your father and I had been talking about making some changes. He wanted to update some things. His will, his accounts. He felt it was time." James's attention sharpened. "Did he now?" "He said he wanted to make sure I was taken care of," Elena continued, her voice soft, almost dreamy. "He said I'd brought joy back into his life after your mother passed. That I deserved security." "My mother passed 5 years ago," James said quietly. "And my father never mentioned any of this to me." "Well, you've been so busy with your own life," Elena said, turning back with a sympathetic smile. "He didn't want to burden you. But he told me everything. About the investment accounts, the properties, the business holdings. He wanted me to know, in case something like this ever happened." James stood slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. "It's interesting that he'd share all that financial information with you but never mentioned updating any legal documents to me. I'm his attorney, Elena. Have been for years." Her smile didn't waver, but something hardened in her eyes. Maybe he wanted to keep some things private. Between us. "Maybe," James agreed, moving toward the door. "Or maybe this conversation is premature. My father isn't dead. He's right here, listening to every word we're saying." He glanced back at his father and saw it, a single tear sliding down the old man's weathered cheek. "I'll be back tomorrow," James said. "Early. And I think we need to have a serious talk about a few things. In the meantime, I'm instructing the nursing staff that no financial documents, no legal papers, nothing of that nature is to be signed by anyone regarding my father's care or estate." Elena's mask finally slipped. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes went cold. "You don't trust me." "I don't know you," James replied. "That's not the same thing. But I'm starting to learn." He left her standing in the room, her performance finally abandoned, her true face emerging in the fluorescent light. As James walked down the corridor, his mind was already racing. Something wasn't right. Something had been wrong for a while, and he'd been too distant, too wrapped up in his own life to see it. That ended now. Tomorrow, he'd start digging. And whatever Elena was hiding, Whatever game she'd been playing with his vulnerable father, he was going to expose every last bit of it. The old man deserved that much. James spent the entire night in his home office, surrounded by scattered papers and glowing computer screens. At 3 a.m., fueled by coffee and determination, he finally found the first thread. His father's banking statements showed a pattern that made his blood run cold. The transfers had started small, a few $100s here and there, withdrawn from his father's checking account. Easy to miss. Easy to dismiss as normal spending. But over the past 6 months, they'd grown exponentially. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. All withdrawn in cash or transferred to accounts James didn't recognize. He pulled up his father's credit card statements next. Designer clothes from boutiques his father would never visit. Jewelry purchases. A weekend at a luxury spa resort. Restaurant charges at places his father, with his modest tastes and old-fashioned sensibilities, would never choose. All of it charged to his father's accounts, but none of it for his father. Smart, James muttered to himself, making notes. Not smart enough. The real revelation came when he accessed his father's investment portfolio. His father had been a careful man, a saver, someone who'd built wealth slowly and steadily over 40 years. The portfolio had been worth nearly $2 million when James had last reviewed it a year ago. Now it showed just over $1 million. Nearly $900,000 had been liquidated over the past 8 months. Coincidentally, right around the time Elena had entered the picture. The money had been moved into a money market account, and from there, it disappeared into a maze of transfers. But it wasn't gone. James knew how to follow money trails. It was what he did for a living, part of his practice in estate law. And this trail, despite attempts to obscure it, led somewhere very specific. At dawn, James made a call to an old friend from law school who now worked as a private investigator. By noon, he had a preliminary report on Elena Vasquez, or rather, the woman calling herself Elena Vasquez. Her real name was Elena Morrison. 42 years old, not the 38 she'd claimed. 2 prior marriages, both to wealthy older men. Both marriages had ended with generous settlements after accusations of infidelity on the men's part. Accusations that, James's investigator friend suggested, might have been manufactured or orchestrated. "She's a professional," his friend said over the phone. "I've seen this pattern before. She finds vulnerable men, usually recently widowed, establishes a relationship, then starts the money drain. If they get suspicious, she has an exit strategy. If they don't, well, she stays until there's nothing left to take." "My father had a stroke," James said, his voice tight. That wasn't part of anyone's plan. No, but it created an opportunity. If she could get access to his accounts, his assets, maybe even get named in a new will before anyone realized what was happening. She'd get everything without having to wait or risk him coming to his senses. James thanked his friend and hung up. He looked at the evidence spread across his desk, bank statements, transfer records, the investigator's report. It was damning, but was it enough? At the hospital that afternoon, James found Elena exactly where he expected her. In his father's room, sitting close to the bed, her hand resting possessively on the old man's arm. She looked up when James entered, and her expression was carefully neutral. "You look tired," she said. "Were you up all night worrying?" "I stayed here. I couldn't leave him." "How devoted," James replied, setting his briefcase down. "Elena, we need to talk. There are some questions I have." "Of course. Anything." "My father's finances. I've been reviewing them, and I've noticed some irregularities. Large withdrawals, transfers, purchases that don't match his usual pattern." Elena's expression didn't change, but James saw her hand tighten slightly on his father's arm. "Your father has been very generous. He's wanted to help me, to make sure I'm comfortable. Is that a crime?" "Not if he actually authorized it," James said. "But I'm wondering if he really understood what he was authorizing. Some of these transactions happened when he was already showing signs of cognitive decline." "That's a lie," Elena said, her voice sharp. "Your father was perfectly clear. Just because you weren't around doesn't mean—" "I have documentation," James interrupted, pulling papers from his briefcase. Medical records showing my father complained of confusion, memory issues, headaches, all signs of the mini-strokes that preceded the major one. Records from 3 months ago, right around the time the large withdrawals started. Elena stood abruptly. "You're accusing me of taking advantage of him." "I'm asking questions. There's a difference." James moved to his father's bedside. The old man's eyes were open, watching intently. "Dad, can you hear me? Blink once for yes." His father blinked. "Did you authorize Elena to take nearly $1 million from your accounts?" The old man's eyes remained open, unwavering. "No blink." "He's sick," Elena protested. "He doesn't understand what you're asking." "Dad, do you want Elena to have access to your medical decisions?" Again, no blink. But this time, something else, a slight movement of his head, barely perceptible, but definitely a shake. "No." James turned to Elena. "I'm officially revoking any informal access you might think you have. As of now, all financial accounts are frozen pending investigation. And I'm requesting that hospital security restrict your visiting hours." Elena's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Her face flushed with anger, and her voice rose. "You can't do this. I have rights. Your father loves me." "My father," James said quietly, "can't speak for himself right now. But his eyes say everything I need to know." As James spoke, a nurse appeared in the doorway, having heard the raised voices. James calmly explained the situation, presenting his medical power of attorney and requesting security. Elena protested, threatened, even wept. But this time, James noted, the tears were real. Tears of rage and frustration, not grief. As security escorted her from the room, Elena turned back one last time. "This isn't over. I'll fight this. I'll sue." "I'm counting on it," James replied. "Discovery should be very interesting." When she was gone, James sat down heavily beside his father's bed. The old man's eyes were wet, but there was something else there now, relief. "I'm sorry, Dad," James said quietly. "I should have been paying attention. I should have seen this coming." His father's hand moved, just slightly, just enough to brush against James's arm. It was forgiveness. It was gratitude. But James knew this wasn't over. Elena wouldn't go quietly. The real battle was just beginning. Elena struck back faster than James had anticipated. 3 days after being removed from the hospital, she appeared with an attorney, a slick, expensive-looking man named Richard Thornton who specialized in elder law and palimony cases. James received the letter at his office, a cease and desist, accompanied by a lawsuit claiming emotional distress, defamation, and breach of promise. Elena was seeking $2 million in damages, claiming his father had promised to marry her and provide for her financially. Attached were photographs of her and his father at restaurants, on a weekend trip, at his father's home. There were printed emails, allegedly from his father's account, discussing their future together and his intentions to take care of her. "It's all manufactured," James told his own attorney, David Chen, later that day. "My father barely uses email. These messages are fake." "Can you prove it?" David asked, scanning through the documents. "Because on the surface, this looks compelling. They have documentation of a relationship, evidence of gifts and financial support, communications discussing the future. A judge might see a legitimate palimony claim." "There has to be something," James insisted. "She's done this before. My investigator found 2 previous relationships with wealthy older men. Similar patterns. Past behavior isn't admissible unless we can establish a pattern of fraud," David explained. "We need concrete evidence that she specifically defrauded your father. The bank transfers alone aren't enough. She can claim they were gifts." James felt frustration building. Elena had been careful, calculating. She'd created just enough of a paper trail to make her claim look legitimate while hiding the real extent of her exploitation. That evening, James returned to his father's house, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where his father had lived for 30 years. He had keys, had always had keys, but he hadn't visited as often as he should have. Now, walking through the familiar rooms, he felt the weight of his neglect. The house showed signs of Elena's presence. Women's clothes in the master bedroom closet. Expensive cosmetics in the bathroom. Her touch in the rearranged furniture, the new curtains, the decorative pillows his father would never have chosen. James started in his father's study, the one room that still felt authentically like the old man. Filing cabinets lined one wall, filled with the meticulous records his father had always kept. James began searching systematically, looking for anything that might help. He found it in an unlabeled folder tucked behind tax returns from 10 years ago, a composition notebook, the kind students use, filled with his father's distinctive handwriting. A journal. James sat down and began reading, and with each page, his anger grew. The entries started 9 months ago, right when Elena had entered his father's life. At first, they were happy, almost giddy. His father writing about meeting someone new, feeling alive again, enjoying companionship after years of loneliness. But the tone shifted about 3 months in. Elena needed money for her car repair. $5,000. Seems expensive, but she says the mechanic is reliable. Another emergency. Her sister's medical bills. $8,000. I want to help, but this is the third emergency this month. She wants to go to Las Vegas for her birthday. I said the drive would be nice. She wants to fly first class, stay at the Bellagio. $12,000 for a weekend seems excessive, but she was so disappointed when I hesitated. The entries became darker, more confused. Can't remember if I authorized that transfer. Elena says I did. She says I'm forgetting things. Maybe I am. Found a credit card bill I don't recognize. Elena says I applied for it. Don't remember doing that. She's worried about me. Says I should let her help manage the finances. Tried to access my investment account online. Password doesn't work. Called the company. They said it was changed 2 weeks ago. I don't remember changing it. Elena says she helped me do it, but I have no memory of this. The final entry was dated 2 days before the stroke. Something is very wrong. I tried to add up the money I've given Elena. It doesn't make sense. The numbers are too large. I went to check my statements, but can't find them. Elena says she filed them, but won't tell me where. When I pressed her, she got angry, said I was accusing her of being a thief. But I'm not accusing. I'm just confused. I'm going to call James tomorrow. I should have called him months ago. I've been a fool. An old, lonely fool. James felt tears on his face. His father had known. At the end, he'd figured it out. But the stroke had come before he could act, before he could reach out for help. He photographed every page of the journal, then secured the original in his briefcase. This was evidence, clear, documented evidence of his father's deteriorating awareness, of Elena's manipulation, of the exploitation. But as he left the house, James noticed something odd. A car was parked across the street, engine running. As he pulled out of the driveway, it followed. Elena wasn't giving up. She was watching, waiting, looking for any advantage. James took a circuitous route back to his apartment, finally losing the tail in downtown traffic. Once home, he immediately called David. I found something, James said, describing the journal. It establishes that my father was confused, that he was questioning the financial transactions, that Elena was controlling access to his records. It shows intent to call me, to get help, right before the stroke. That's excellent, David said. But James, you need to be careful. If Elena knows you have that journal. She's having me followed. I saw someone outside my father's house. There was a pause. This has escalated beyond a simple estate dispute. File a police report about the surveillance. And let me file an emergency motion to get a full accounting of your father's finances. If we can show a pattern of unauthorized transfers, we can get a restraining order and possibly freeze her assets. Over the next week, James and David worked around the clock. They subpoenaed bank records, credit card statements, and phone records. They deposed the managers of his father's investment accounts. And slowly, a picture emerged that was even worse than James had initially believed. Elena had been more than just taking money. She'd been systematically preparing to take everything. She'd tried to add herself as a joint owner on multiple accounts, succeeding with 2 of them. She'd attempted to get his father to sign a new will, drafted by a discount legal service, that left her the house and half of everything else. His father had refused, but only barely, and only because some small part of him had still been alert enough to resist. Most damning was a recording from the investment company's customer service line. Elena had called, pretending to be James, trying to authorize a complete liquidation of the portfolio with transfer to an offshore account. The representative had refused without in-person verification, but the attempt was documented, time-stamped, and preserved. She was planning to take everything and disappear, David said, listening to the recording. If your father hadn't had the stroke, if she'd had just a few more months to work on him. She would have succeeded, James finished. And my father would have died alone and broke, probably still believing she loved him. Armed with evidence, they filed motions with the court, to freeze Elena's assets, to get a full forensic accounting, to secure a restraining order. They also forwarded everything to the district attorney's office with a request to investigate for elder fraud. Elena's attorney, Thornton, tried to fight back, but the evidence was overwhelming. The journal entries, the recorded call, the documented pattern of withdrawals matching Elena's personal purchases, it all painted a picture of calculated exploitation. The hearing was set for the following week. But James knew Elena wouldn't go down without a fight. And desperate people did desperate things. He just didn't know how desperate she'd become until he received the phone call at 2 a.m. It was the hospital. Someone had tried to access his father's room outside of visiting hours. Security had intercepted them, but not before they'd reached the 4 line. The someone was Elena, and his father's condition had suddenly, mysteriously deteriorated. James arrived at the hospital to find it swarming with police. His father had been moved to the ICU, and a guard now stood outside his door. A detective intercepted James in the corridor, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Detective Sarah Morrison. "Mr. Patterson," she said, showing her badge. "I need to ask you some questions about Elena Vasquez and her relationship with your father." "Where is she?" James demanded. "What did she do to him?" "Ms. Vasquez is in custody. Hospital security caught her attempting to access your father's room at 1:47 a.m. When they stopped her, she was holding a syringe. We're having it analyzed now." James felt his blood run cold. A syringe? What was in it? "We don't know yet. But your father's attending physician, Dr. Ramirez, noticed an irregular spike in his sedation levels about 30 minutes after the incident. Someone had tampered with his 4 medication, increased the dosage significantly. If the nurse hadn't caught it during routine monitoring, he would have died," James finished, his voice hollow. "She tried to kill him." "We're investigating that possibility," Morrison said carefully. "Ms. Vasquez claims she was just trying to visit, that she loves your father and was worried about him. She says the syringe contained vitamins she wanted to give him to help with his recovery. She insists the hospital is being dramatic." "That's insane. The hospital has visiting hours, and nobody brings syringes to give vitamins to a stroke patient." "I agree," Morrison said, "which is why she's being held for questioning. But I need to understand the full context. Your attorney sent us evidence of financial exploitation. Walk me through everything." For the next hour, James laid out the entire story. Elena's entrance into his father's life, the pattern of manipulation and withdrawals, the journal entries, the attempted unauthorized transfers. He provided copies of everything David had compiled. Morrison listened carefully, taking notes. When James finished, she sat back with a heavy sigh. "I've seen cases like this before," she said. "Elder fraud is more common than people think. But it usually doesn't escalate to potential violence. Most of these predators just take the money and disappear when they're caught. They don't risk murder charges." "Unless," James said slowly, "she had more to lose than I realized. Unless there's something else we haven't found yet." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" "Elena's been doing this for years. My investigator found 2 previous relationships with wealthy older men. Both ended with her getting settlements. What if there are more? What if she's built an entire life on this kind of exploitation, and exposure would destroy everything? Or what if, Morrison added, one of those previous relationships didn't end as cleanly as it appeared? The detective made some calls. By morning, they had a broader picture of Elena Morrison's history, and it was chilling. There had been 4 significant relationships before James's father, not 2. All with wealthy men over 60. All recently widowed. And in 2 of those cases, the men had died unexpectedly, one from a heart attack, one from an accidental overdose of medication. Neither death was investigated as suspicious at the time, Morrison explained. Both men were elderly, both had health issues. But now, looking at the pattern. You think she killed them, James said. I think we need to look more closely at those deaths. I've already contacted the jurisdictions involved. They're reopening the investigations. In his father's ICU room, James sat beside the bed and held the old man's hand. His father looked worse than before, frailer, more vulnerable. The increased sedation had been caught in time, but it had taken a toll. The doctors weren't sure what the long-term effects might be. I'm so sorry, Dad, James whispered. I should have been here. I should have been paying attention. His father's eyes opened slowly, focused on James's face. There was no blame there, only exhaustion and something that might have been relief. She's in custody, James continued. She can't hurt you anymore. And I'm going to make sure she pays for everything she's done. To you. To those other men. To everyone she's hurt. A slight pressure on his hand, his father squeezing back, just barely, but enough. Over the next several days, the investigation expanded. Detectives in 2 other states exhumed bodies. Forensic accountants traced Elena's financial history across a decade. And slowly, horrifyingly, a pattern emerged. Elena Morrison was a serial predator who had been operating for at least 12 years. She targeted lonely, wealthy older men, established relationships, drained their finances, and then, in at least 2 cases, had hastened their deaths when the money ran out or when they began to catch on to her schemes. The toxicology reports on the exhumed bodies showed elevated levels of digoxin, a heart medication, in both cases, enough to cause fatal heart attacks in men who had pre-existing conditions. Elena had been listed as a beneficiary or had received significant gifts from both men shortly before their deaths. The syringe she'd been carrying when caught at the hospital? It contained a concentrated dose of insulin, enough to send James's father into hypoglycemic shock. With his weakened condition, it almost certainly would have been fatal. And with his history of stroke and diabetes, it might have appeared natural. She's done this before, David told James when they met to discuss the criminal charges. She's refined her method. She finds vulnerable men, gains their trust, takes their money, and when it's time to move on, or when they get suspicious, she eliminates them and moves to the next target. How many others? James asked. How many men did she do this to? The police have identified 7 relationships over 12 years. 2 deaths that are now confirmed as homicides. 3 others they're still investigating. And 2, like your father, where she took the money but the relationship ended before the worst could happen. James felt sick. His father had been so close to becoming another statistic, another elderly victim of a predator who exploited loneliness and trust. The preliminary hearing was held a week later. Elena appeared in court wearing a simple dress, her hair pulled back, playing the role of the wronged woman. But when the prosecution began presenting evidence, the toxicology reports, the financial records, the testimony from previous victims' families, her mask began to crack. James was called to testify. He spoke about finding his father's journal, about the pattern of manipulation, about the midnight attempt on his father's life. He kept his voice steady, professional, but inside he was burning with anger at what this woman had done, what she'd tried to do. When Elena's attorney tried to cross-examine him, suggesting that James had misinterpreted his father's confused writings, that the financial gifts were legitimate, James pulled out one final piece of evidence. Your Honor, he said, I'd like to submit video footage from my father's home security system. He had cameras installed after a break-in in his neighborhood 5 years ago. He never mentioned them to Elena. The footage showed Elena, alone in the house, going through his father's filing cabinets, photographing documents, practicing his signature on a notepad. The timestamp was from 3 months before the stroke. She wasn't his girlfriend, James said, looking directly at Elena. She was a predator studying her prey. Elena's face drained of color. Her attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but she pushed him away, standing suddenly. He was going to die anyway, she shouted, her composure finally shattering. He was old, sick, lonely. I gave him companionship. I made his last months happy. I deserved compensation for that. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, but Elena kept talking, her voice rising hysterically. Those other men, they were the same. They had no one. I was there for them. I made them feel loved. Is it my fault they were grateful? Is it my fault they wanted to provide for me? Her attorney was frantically trying to silence her, but the damage was done. In her rage and frustration, Elena had essentially confessed to everything. The judge ordered her remanded without bail. As bailiffs led her from the courtroom, she looked back at James one last time, and her expression was pure venom. Your father was a fool, she spat. They all were. Lonely old fools desperate for attention. I gave them what they wanted. No, James replied quietly. You gave them lies. And you took everything else. As she was dragged away, still screaming, James felt something release in his chest. It wasn't over. There would be a trial, more hearings, more painful revelations. But his father was safe. The predator had been caught. Now came the long road to justice and recovery. 3 months after Elena's arrest, James sat in his father's hospital room, though hospital room wasn't quite accurate anymore. His father had been transferred to a rehabilitation facility 2 months ago, and the progress, while slow, had been remarkable. Again, Dad, James encouraged, holding up the communication board. Point to the word. His father's hand moved shakily across the board, finally landing on a word, thank you. You don't need to thank me, James said, his throat tight. I should have been there sooner. I should have seen what was happening. His father's hand moved again, slower this time, my fault. No, James said firmly. What Elena did, what she does, it's calculated. It's predatory. She spent years learning how to manipulate people, how to exploit loneliness and trust. You weren't weak or foolish. You were human. You wanted companionship after Mom died. There's nothing wrong with that. The speech therapist had said his father might regain some verbal communication, but it would take time. The stroke had done significant damage. But his mind was sharp. That had become clear as he'd emerged from the worst of it. His eyes were alert again, aware. He could understand everything, even if expressing himself remained difficult. I have news about the case, James continued, settling into the chair beside the bed. Elena's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal. The DA refused. With evidence from your case and the 2 confirmed homicides, plus the other suspected cases, they're pursuing maximum charges. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, elder fraud, identity theft. She's looking at life without parole. His father's expression was complicated, satisfaction mixed with something that might have been sadness. I know, James said, reading his father's face as he'd learned to do over the past months. Part of you remembers the good times at the beginning. Part of you wonders if any of it was real. His father nodded slightly. The therapist I've been seeing, yes, I'm seeing a therapist. This whole thing has been a lot. She says that's normal. Elena is good at what she does. She made you feel cared for, valued. Those feelings were real, even if her motives weren't. That's what makes people like her so dangerous. James pulled out his tablet and opened a document. The DA wanted you to see this. It's the victim impact statement from the son of Gerald Hutchins, one of the men Elena killed. He wanted you to know you're not alone. He read aloud, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. Gerald Hutchins's son described how his father had changed after meeting Elena, how he'd become secretive about finances, how he defended her when family questioned the relationship. Then the sudden death, the discovery of depleted accounts, the realization of what had happened. The guilt of not seeing it sooner. The anger at the predator who'd stolen not just money but his father's final months. Sound familiar? James asked softly when he finished. His father's eyes were wet. 6 families, James continued. 6 families saying the same thing. Describing the same pattern. Elena has destroyed lives, Dad. But you survived. And because you survived, because we caught her, she can't do this to anyone else. Over the following weeks, James worked with the DA's office to prepare for trial. His father's case was the strongest. The journal, the video footage, the documented financial exploitation, and the attempted murder at the hospital all combined to create an overwhelming body of evidence. But the prosecutors wanted to include testimony about the other cases too, to establish the pattern. James interviewed families, reviewed evidence, helped build the narrative of a serial predator who'd operated in the shadows for over a decade. The trial began on a cold February morning. The courthouse was packed with media, victims' families, and curious onlookers. Elena sat at the defense table looking small and subdued, nothing like the confident, charming woman who'd entered his father's life a year ago. James was called to testify on the second day. He walked through the timeline methodically, his father's initial joy at meeting Elena, the gradual financial drain, the signs of manipulation, the journal entries documenting growing confusion and concern, and finally the midnight attempt on his father's life. The defense attorney tried to paint James as an estranged son who'd neglected his father and then created a conspiracy theory out of guilt. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video footage alone destroyed any claim that Elena had been a legitimate girlfriend. When the prosecution played the security camera video for the jury, Elena rifling through files, practicing signatures, photographing documents, several jurors visibly recoiled. The testimony from the medical examiner about the 2 confirmed homicides was devastating. Both men had died from digoxin poisoning, masked as heart attacks. Both had recently changed their wills to benefit Elena. Both had shown signs of cognitive decline in the weeks before their deaths. Decline that, the expert testified, could have been induced by smaller doses of digoxin over time. She didn't just kill them, the medical examiner explained. She made them confused first, made them doubt their own judgment, made them dependent on her. Then, when she had what she wanted, or when they started to catch on, she eliminated them. Elena's defense was weak, that the deaths were natural, that the relationships were legitimate, that she genuinely cared for these men. But the prosecution's forensic accountant demolished this narrative, showing how Elena had systematically targeted and drained each victim, following the same playbook each time. On the 5th day of trial, the prosecution played Elena's outburst from the preliminary hearing, her shouting that the men were lonely old fools who deserved to be exploited because they wanted companionship. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. James was in his father's room at the rehabilitation facility when he got the call. He put it on speaker so his father could hear. All counts, David repeated. Murder 1 on 2 counts, attempted murder, multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. The judge is scheduling sentencing for next month, but the DA thinks she'll get life without parole on the murder convictions alone. His father's hand found James's, squeezing with surprising strength. After the call ended, they sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, his father reached for the communication board and slowly spelled out a message, "Can rest now." "Yeah," James agreed, wiping his eyes. "We all can." But the aftermath wasn't just about Elena's conviction. James had spent the months since her arrest doing something else, trying to recover what she'd stolen. With help from David and a team of forensic accountants, they'd traced Elena's assets. She'd been smart, hiding money in multiple accounts under different names. But she'd also been greedy, keeping most of it accessible for her own use. They recovered nearly $700,000 of his father's money, enough to cover the medical bills and rehabilitation costs. The rest was distributed among the other victims' families, though no amount of money could truly compensate for what had been lost. More importantly, James had worked with local law enforcement and adult protective services to implement better safeguards. New training for bank employees on recognizing elder fraud. Support groups for older adults living alone. Educational programs about financial predators. Your father's case is going to help a lot of people, the Adult Protective Services Coordinator told James at one of their meetings. The publicity around the trial has raised awareness. We're seeing more reports, more families paying attention. That spotlight might prevent the next Elena Morrison. 6 months after the trial, James helped his father move into a new apartment, a smaller place in a building with good security and an active community. The old house held too many bad memories, and they'd sold it without regret. His father had regained some speech, halting and difficult, but present. He could walk with a cane. He'd never be exactly who he was before the stroke, but he was himself again. Alert, aware, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. "Better," his father said one evening as they sat on the apartment's small balcony, watching the sunset. The single word took effort, but the meaning was clear. Better than what? James asked, though he knew. Than before. Before her. Lonely then. "You're not lonely anymore," James confirmed. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And I've been talking to some of your old friends from the VFW. They want to start up the poker games again." His father smiled, a real smile, the first James had seen in a year. Elena Morrison was sentenced to life without parole plus 50 years. At her sentencing, James read a victim impact statement on behalf of his father. "Elena Morrison didn't just try to steal my father's money. She tried to steal his dignity, his autonomy, his final years. She almost succeeded. But my father is a survivor. He's stronger than she gave him credit for. And while he'll live with the consequences of what she did for the rest of his life, he'll live. He'll be surrounded by people who genuinely love him. He'll have purpose and joy and community. Elena Morrison has none of those things. She has only her cell and the knowledge that she'll never hurt anyone again." When Elena was led from the courtroom, she looked at James one final time. He met her gaze steadily, no longer angry, no longer afraid. Just done. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked James how he felt. "Relieved," he said honestly. "And grateful. Grateful that my father survived. Grateful that we caught her before she could hurt anyone else. And grateful for the lesson learned, that we need to look out for the vulnerable people in our lives. We need to pay attention. We need to be present." A year after Elena's conviction, James sat in his father's apartment helping him write emails to old friends. His father's typing was slow but steady, his mind sharp as ever. "Tell Frank, his joke was terrible," his father dictated, grinning. James typed, then read the message aloud before sending it. His father laughed, a rusty sound, but genuine. "You know what the therapist told me last week?" James asked. "She said dealing with trauma isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about integrating it, learning from it, and not letting it define you." "Smart woman," his father replied. "She is. And you know what? I think we're doing okay. Both of us. We survived something terrible. We exposed a predator. We helped other families get justice. And we found our way back to each other." His father reached over and squeezed James's shoulder, his grip stronger than it had been in months. "Family," he said clearly. The single word contained everything. "Yeah," James agreed, his voice thick. "Family." Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside, two survivors sat together in comfortable silence, having learned the hardest way possible that love couldn't be bought or faked, that real relationships required presence and attention, and that the strongest bonds were forged not in easy times but in the fire of adversity overcome. Elena Morrison had tried to destroy them. Instead, she'd brought them back together. And in the end, that was the greatest justice of all.